Well, good morning. I appreciate you making that tiny mistake because it helped me relax a little bit by having the wrong, because I've spent most of the morning. Do I have the right order of service? Do I have the right message? Do I have the right things like that? Am I in the right place? I actually, when I was a young minister, showed up at a church to represent the senior pastor. I was just a summer youth minister, but he sent me to this church to represent him. He wasn't able to make it to that funeral. And it was the end of the service before I knew for sure if I was in the right place or not, because I didn't know anybody. They didn't know me. I really appreciate the opportunity to be here, and I will apologize. I'll probably be taking my glasses off and on. I don't have the kind yet that I truly need to avoid that. I've known George, as said in the bio a little bit. I've known George. We've intersected a few different places, including at what used to be North Raleigh Community Church, which is now Common Thread Church, and where I attend and participate. Attending takes on a whole different meaning nowadays, of course, but certainly appreciate his trust and your trust to allow me to stand here this morning. You will soon see, I think, that I'm not the most entertaining speaker you've ever heard, but I do believe that what you hear today is going to be more than worthwhile. I'm reminded, again, even though I know I'm not the most entertaining speaker, I know that about myself. That doesn't keep me from trying to tell a joke or two. Just ask my teenagers, they're budding young adults, both 19 and both headed back out to their second year of college soon. They will tell you that I'm definitely, my picture is beside dad joke in the dictionary or on Wikipedia. But I'm reminded of a time when the preacher said that it was going to be a time of confession and talked about how much that confession is good for the soul. And he finally persuaded some people to start confessing. He'd probably prepared some people and had some plants in the audience. And one person got up and confessed one thing. I grew up Southern Baptist, so I confessed that I went out dancing on Saturday night. And someone else confessed something else and something else. And finally, I'm not gonna tell you the full version of the joke because I don't want to ruin my reputation on my first visit with you. But finally, someone confessed something and the crowd got quiet. And whereas everybody else, tell it, confess, tell it, confess. When that person said what they had done, a cool quiet descended on the house. And finally, someone said, I don't think I'd have told that. I'm not going to ask you to talk about your failures. Failure in Grace is the title for the lesson today. I'm not going to ask you to confess your failures this morning, but I suspect that most, if not all of you, have experienced some kind of failure in your life. If you haven't, you just haven't lived long enough. And I guarantee you will get there. But I'm pretty sure like that. I'm not going to ask for you to raise your hands, but how many of you failed at something that was really important to you? Or maybe you've experienced failure as something important to you, even though you don't think you failed, it still maybe was a failure and maybe it was someone else's doing or circumstances. Or maybe just simply experiencing life not turning out the way you thought it was supposed to turn out. Maybe some, if not all of us, have had hopes and dreams shattered or perhaps just not materialized. And like I said, today I'm going to be talking about some of those times. And I'm going to be sharing a little bit of my story, even though I'm not going to be asking you to share your own failures. You can go on Facebook and post those later if you'd like. I don't recommend it, but you can if you like. There's a band I like a lot called Mumford & Sons, and there's a song, the title of it is Broken Crown. And one section of the song says, so crawl on my belly till the sun goes down. I'll never wear your broken crown. I took the road and I effed it all away. Now in this twilight, how dare you speak of grace? How dare you speak of grace? Part of my bio was read. The parts I'm going to share with you a little bit today, hopefully in the service of talking about failure and grace, are not things that I put in my bio. But in the past few years, as mentioned, I've worked an awful lot with people who've experienced failures or shattering of dreams. It was mentioned that I currently work with the North Carolina Victim Assistance Network as Director of Homicide Support Services. What that means is, among other things, I do a lot of work directly with people who've had loved ones murdered. I do support groups and one-on-one conversations and going to court with folks. I also do have a therapy practice, as was mentioned, and of course there are times when the folks who come to me in that context have some failures, some shattered hopes and dreams that they need to talk about and need to do some work around. If I go back a little further, I actually mentioned that I lived in Zebulon, so I'm very familiar with this area. I've been in the Raleigh area now for a good bit more than half my life. Lived in Zebulon for a few years, and it was after I moved from Zebulon to Raleigh, eventually found myself working actually with the families of people on death row, and talk about some families who've experienced failure. On the one hand, it being some of the most difficult things I've ever heard. One night, a mom on the night of her son's execution, just a few miles down the road from where we sat, just would spill out a lifetime of regret and her sense of failure, her sense of shame, her sense of guilt, and then would stop and ask, have they done it yet? And we knew what she was asking, had they done yet? And then she would go again, just spilling so much, and then would stop and ask, have they done it yet? And that cycle repeated several times until we finally said, yeah, it's official. They've done it now. They've taken your son's life. Worked for a few more years with a group called Murder Victims Families for Reconciliation, which were actually loved ones of murder victims who opposed the death penalty. But in the context of those stories, it's beyond count how in those two contexts and in the therapy setting and in my current job with so many conversations with loved ones who've had unspeakable, senseless tragedy befall them, have heard truly difficult things. By the way, if you're ever flying and don't want somebody to talk to you on an airplane, I've figured out something. I tell them what I do. And either they start telling me a story because they have been touched by violence in such a way, or they're done with the conversation. But in addition to those incredible stories of pain and tragedy and horror, loss, I'm also privileged to hear so many stories of just amazing courage and resilience and love and grace. Many ups and downs. Perhaps the most exciting time of my life was when my wife and I started a house of hospitality. That's actually where we were that night when that mom's son was being executed. We had started this house of hospitality. People without homes who had medical issues could come there and recover from their illness or injury rather than being forced to wander around the streets all day long, or perhaps go with compromised immune systems to be in the shelter. We provided a place for them to stay, and we also provided a place for loved ones of people on death row to come. Some people have heard it described and said, oh, kind of like a Ronald McDonald House. And so yes, it was kind of like a Ronald McDonald House. Folks from out of town could come and stay in our hospitality house free of charge. So it was free. It was a friendly, non-judgmental place, which was such a rare space for them to find themselves in. And we did so many wonderful things. Organized a walk from Raleigh to Washington, D.C., raising awareness about the death penalty, about restorative justice, about the needs of loved ones of homicide victims, as well as calling for compassion for the families of those responsible are some of the most horrible things that happen. That experience, we called it Nazareth House, that experience ended with a mighty fall. That dream, that calling, that wonderful work, and that marriage came to an end all at once. Perhaps, I could say this about some other things, but perhaps the most painful time, certainly one of the most painful times, and oh my, did I feel like a failure. And while I could make it, but I'm my own worst critic, because no matter, so when I get home this afternoon, I can tell you what I'll be doing. Why did I say that? Why didn't I say that? I'm my own worst critic. And in that experience, of course, I was looking at what had I done to contribute to that failure, and what had been beyond my control that had just happened. It was certainly a time where my faith, my spirituality was challenged. It was like, oh, we're doing this great stuff. How could you let this happen to us? You'll hear hints of that in the scripture that I'm about to read. And did I mention, I know I mentioned to some in the back that I grew up Southern Baptist in southeastern North Carolina, a place so rural that we thought a town of 8,000 was a city. It was full of city folks. And when I moved to Raleigh, my family, I'm convinced they think I moved up north. And that means there's no disrespect for them. They're really fine people. But grew up in a very rural, very conservative Southern Baptist family and Southern Baptist church. Divorce, that marriage ended in divorce. Divorce is not one of those things you put on your resume. And it's one of those things in that tradition, certainly at that time. I've gone in some different directions since that time, launched from that foundation. But divorce is not one of the things you put on the resume. It's one of those things that can brand you unworthy of standing in a place like where I stand this morning. And a marriage and family therapist, I just had layers upon layers about why I shouldn't have let this happen, or it shouldn't have happened to me, or it just felt like the biggest failure in the world, that combination of things. And shame came along with that failure. Sometimes guilt, which is different. Guilt is when you've actually done something wrong and maybe you can acknowledge it and maybe you can make corrections. But shame is a much more insidious thing that really doesn't tell you you've done something wrong. It just tells you you're a bad person. And I was getting a lot of, not only maybe I had done some things wrong, but I was a bad, awful person. I debated a little bit about just how far I was going to go with this. I'm going to add one more thing. A few years later, I found myself struggling with overuse of alcohol, struggling eventually with recognizing addiction. You know, again, that's not on the list of things you're supposed to do if you're a good Southern Baptist boy, which I used to be considered to be. So with that having been said, and acknowledging that my oversight of skipping right past the scripture, I'm going to now pause and read the scripture. Sometimes things work out the way they're supposed to work out. And the scripture comes from 1 Kings chapter 19. Just a little bit of background to the story. If you remember at all the story of Elijah, Elijah is considered one of the mightiest of prophets. Elijah, just before this passage of scripture, had called down fire from heaven, that very famous passage where the other prophets had cried out and cried out and cried out, and Elijah even trolled them a little bit, is the current term, trolled them a little bit and said, oh, you maybe should cry a little louder, maybe he can't hear you, or maybe you should wake him up, maybe he just can't hear you. And eventually fire didn't come down, but when Elijah prayed to God, fire came down, consumed the offering, even after he had dumped barrels and barrels of water on it. And shortly after that, he got word that the powers that were out to get him because he had shown them up. And scripture says that then Elijah was afraid. He got up and fled for his life. And that's where our scripture begins today. in 1 Kings chapter 19, verse 4. But he himself went a day's journey into the wilderness and came and sat down under a solitary broom tree. He asked that he might die. It is enough now, O Lord. Take my life, for I am no better than my ancestors. And then he lay down under the broom tree and fell asleep. And I'll pause there and ask you maybe to get in touch with a time when you felt that way. Like, I'm no better than anybody, I'm just a failure. And I'm just going to curl up in a ball and go to sleep. And then scripture continues, suddenly an angel touched him and said to him, get up and eat. He looked, and there at his head was a cake baked on hot stones and a jar of water. He ate and drank, and he lay down again. The angel of the Lord came a second time, touched him, and said, get up and eat. Otherwise, the journey will be too much for you. He got up and ate and drank, and then he went in the strength of that food 40 days and 40 nights to Horeb, the Mount of God. And I will tell you that when scripture goes on to talk about how when Elijah went to that Mount of God, he found a cave and he found another place to curl up and go to sleep until the voice of God came to him, not in an earthquake, not in a mighty wind, but in a still small voice. So one way of looking at this whole story is that Elijah first triumphed, but then he ran, then he rested and replenished himself, then he ranted, then he listened. George said in some manner that you were working as a congregation on listening. So Elijah listened. Eventually, Elijah received a new call a little further in scripture. And then a little later, he retired. I have to use that alliteration with all those R's just to honor my roots, my Southern Baptist preacher roots. So I'm in a very different place, mentally, emotionally, psychologically, spiritually, than I was when I was growing up Southern Baptist and frankly, well into my adult years. And nevertheless, that sense of failure, of just that I was so unworthy, I was probably beyond repair, was so heavy on me, that shame. Even though I had so moved on from that place of my upbringing, I carried all those messages with me. And I hope you can apply this passage from Maya Angelou. I first heard this quote in an interview on NPR, and she said that if you know that Thomas Wolfe is a writer who wrote the novel You Can't Go Home Again. Well, Maya Angelou said, well, Thomas Wolfe warned in the title of America's great novel that you can't go home again. I enjoyed the book, but I never agreed with this title. I believe that one can never leave home. I believe that one carries the shadows, the dreams, the fears and dragons of home under one's skin, at the extreme corners of one's eyes, and possibly in the gristle of the earlobe. I love her way with words. And so I was carrying very much of that tradition of my upbringing and where I had come from, even though I had gone quite a ways from that place, at least formally and officially. So that's where I am. At least that's where I was. That's part of my story. It's my truth, or at least it's part of my truth. And it's where I find my story and my life's journey intersecting with this story from Scripture and from even the journey of Elijah. And I've already gone over with you sort of what had happened before. Great victory, then running scared, then finding a place to curl up and go to sleep, at least is the way I picture it. And how was this running scared and this curling up in a ball met? The angel woke him up and said, "What the heck are you doing here? Get up and get to work," right? Wrong. The angel said, "Get up and eat." You don't know what else the angel said, but I imagine those words to be spoken with such gentleness, with firmness and strength, but with gentleness. Get up and eat. And then after going back to sleep, the angel again wakes Elijah. I imagine a little more urgency in the angel's voice this time. Get up and eat. Otherwise, the journey will be too much for you. I always think of when we do communion, I think of that line, eat. Otherwise, the journey will be too much for us. So the angel invited Elijah to eat, to replenish himself, to rest some more, and then to get up and move on to what actually in context was a safer place. I see Elijah as being met in his moment of intense failure, as being met with nothing but grace. And grace that wasn't just in words alone, but grace that took a very practical form. I often mention when I'm doing trainings about how to assist loved ones of murder victims, 5 Ps, and I'll probably leave one off. But the idea of being present, showing up. And the angel and later the very presence and voice of God showed up. So being present, being practical. You know, there's bread and drink right there waiting for them, that practical need. We all have, not just those who've had tremendous tragedy, but also being proactive. As the mom of whose adopted daughter had been murdered said, you know I need to eat, so don't ask me if there's anything you can do for me. Bring me food. If you see my grass needs mowing, don't say, let me know if there's anything I can do for you. Mow my grass. So being present, being practical, and being proactive, and also being persistent. All these P's show up in this passage of the way God showed grace through presence, through meeting practical needs, through being proactive. Didn't wait for Elijah to say, "Ooh, that was a nice nap. I am so hungry." But was proactive and then was persistent. Woke him once, woke him twice, led him to the next place, showed up. They had a conversation eventually. Part of the good news of the Gospels, in my view and in the views of many, is that God seems to have a special concern for and a special tenderness for so-called failures. This is just one story, but they're sprinkled all throughout Christian scripture and Hebrew scripture as well, and many other sacred texts. But it seems that God has a special place in God's heart and God's mind, in God's tenderness for those who are so-called failures. Richard Rohr, perhaps you've heard of him. If you've been around George, I suspect you've heard of Richard Rohr. And several things that Richard Rohr says. One is talking about how that sometimes it's the prostitutes and sinners and tax collectors and outcasts. Tax collectors in that day were really bad people, dirty people considered to be. But that those are the people who seem to get the gospel more than people who were the apparent successes in life. Richard Rohr also says that perhaps the place that God can really get to us is when we can't fix it, we can't control it, we can't even understand it. Those places where we can't fix it, we can't control it, we can't even understand it, perhaps are the places where God can actually get to us the way God got to Elijah here. Richard Rohr also talks about the importance of the radical spiritual journey, the radical outward journey and the radical inward journey. I want to think about that in terms of grace today. I often say at the support groups for loved ones of murder victims that I facilitate, one of the group agreements, one of the guidelines is to treat yourself and others with gentleness and kindness, with grace. And I often comment that in my experience, it's much easier to treat others with gentleness, with grace, than it is to treat ourselves with grace. And so this morning, I invite you to the harder part of that. If it indeed is showing grace to yourself, and if you're one of those that your bigger issue or your bigger difficulty is showing grace to others, there's plenty of room and oh, what so much need for that as well. I'll bet you've heard, one other Richard Rohr line that comes to mind. Given this age, I might not have understood that this 20 or so years ago, but the second half of life, in the second half of life, success has little, if anything, to teach us, but it's failure. It's failure when we think we've failed, when we perhaps have objectively failed, when we can really learn. You've heard, I'm sure, the phrase, seen it on a bumper sticker, seen it on a wall somewhere, a poster, seen it on a t-shirt, be the change you long to see in the world. I want to change one word of that today, is be the grace you long to see in the world. And be the grace you long to receive in the world. Play the grace card. Play the grace card. Which is harder for you? Is it grace out there in the world? Is it grace toward people who don't know how to drive? Is it grace toward people who don't pick up their dog poop in the neighborhood? Is it grace toward the folks who leave the shopping carts in the parking lot and then they roll and bump into your car? Is it grace toward someone who's actually done something that's more than one of my pet peeves, but is actually something that's been harmful to you and damaging to you, or toward someone you love? Or is playing the grace card and being the grace you long to see, that grace toward yourself? That grace that allows you to accept the grace from beyond, the grace from others, and at times the grace of that still small voice within. Would you pray with me? Once again, oh God, give us ears to hear, hearts to receive, minds to understand, and give us the courage to act on that gift of grace that is beyond our deserving, that is beyond sometimes our ability to comprehend. Amen.